the Senteon and CIS webinar series, a deep dive into the CIS benchmarks. You are only having me today as your host, Zach Krumkowski over from Senteon. Our co-host Rich McGraw had other commitments this week, but we are still joined by our special guest, Chris Johnson of CompTIA. How you doing, man?
Hey, good to be here.
Really excited for this conversation because everyone knows the brand CompTIA, but who is CompTIA? So excited to hear your point of view and what you're working on. But Chris, I know a little bit about your background. We've been building our relationship the last few months. You know, you were an MSP, MSP owner, still very close with the space and work hands-on with a lot of MSP friends and colleagues still today. But do you mind just introducing yourself a little bit and maybe how you got into the security space?
I think like many, I absolutely fell into the security space. I can say it was career paths that we took. If you maybe went to school for IT or information systems or something in that vein, who knows where you landed. I landed at U-Haul. Because that, like, back then everybody was graduating with degrees in information system something, and everybody was like, I have no idea what we're going to do with you because no one needs that today. So that was the early 2000s. I ended up working for a company doing prostate cancer research, data aggregation. So
That's a cool beginning.
so I got thrust into the compliance space on the privacy side, like almost on day one in the digital space, right? So I did that for a while. Like many that fell into IT, you started learning new things and developing your skills and so on and so forth. Like you had the 800 number from Microsoft, those kind of things. Like, I'm an expert on tech support. Watch this. I'll call Microsoft and they'll answer the phone, because back then they did. It was part of their money, right? Like that
It was included. You didn't have to pay $33 an hour or whatever it is.
No, it was $250 per incident. It wasn't necessarily a guarantee that they could solve your problem, but anyways, so fast forward, I got the itch to start an MSP. And when I did that, I think most MSPs early on, you either have the opportunity with clients that you think you can serve that are in a specific vertical, or you just decide, like, I'm going to do it better than the company that I was at. And that's one of those is probably resonating with a lot of people, right? We found ourselves doing any IT for anybody, whether it was a web app that needed to be reconfigured and hosted in a better environment, or someone's, can't get an Outlook to open on their Mac, and that's where their entire livelihood lives, right?
Everything, right? When you started out, it wasn't just security. It wasn't. It was.
There was no, I mean, shoot, if you could be a web application support person and you were considered a system admin, right? Like there was no, you just kind of one title. Yeah, there were no line, none. In fact, I remember at one point being, like wanting to shame people that built websites that didn't understand how the hosting and DNS and all that stuff worked. Like, how dare you send me, a 2 gig image and say, it's not loading fast enough on the homepage on my 56K modem connection. But I got thrust into the healthcare space kind of as a byproduct of wanting to provide IT services and realizing that we needed to focus on something. And at the time, the majority, however much it might have been by a percentage or two, was healthcare. And so we decided to just focus on that. And in doing so, 2013 came along with the omnibus rule, which then added all those security rules. And that's kind of how I got into cybersecurity, like wanting to ensure that whatever we were building out wasn't just best practices, but we were confident in our ability to support it and educate our clients as to why we were building out configurations the way we did. So I might not sell you the $10,000 server because, everybody's selling $10,000 servers. And if you're getting money from the government, why not put the biggest server in? But we would not compromise on things like firewalls and, VLAN segmentation, because we saw what the repercussions would be if they weren't configured properly. So
I want to pause right here. Sorry to interrupt, but
no, you're fine. That's it. That's the answer.
Point of this. Yeah. So Senteon, we do OS hardening, workstation servers, all that. But I still run into conversations today with my MSP audience saying, I don't want to harden my end user's device for disruption. I don't know how to sell this to them because they're not going to know what hardening is. They're not asking for this. It sounds like even in mid 2000s or that time from your story, when you said configuring, were you talking about workstations and servers, or was that out of scope?
So I wouldn't say out of scope. So I think through error of omission, we like many probably had some level of belief that the vendor who built the operating system for that server had some
You think?
inkling of what it meant to build it out correctly. So while we weren't necessarily hardening OS images to the point that we could have necessarily, we were doing things like making sure that endpoint protection was on the machines, which at that time obviously is
Yep.
not what it is today. But fill in the blank, right? Like I would say basics of network and OS security were definitely present. And I think to your point about, how do you sell the hardening side of this to your end users? I think it's less about selling the hardening and selling like, hey, if you go and buy a computer at Best Buy,
There you go.
your expectations of that machine aren't that, oh, I bet at night when the lights are off and no one's here, someone goes around and makes sure that they've all been patched, they're super secure, right? Like there's no
That's what Geek
malware.
Squad is, isn't
That's
it?
right,
That's why
absolutely.
they're there.
And they only operate after hours too. That's why you never see anybody at the counter. Like I think that is absolutely 100% the world we live in today. And you go back 5 to 10 years, and buying a computer at Best Buy was the only option
Yep.
really that you had versus buying through a solution provider or some sort of distribution model that most consumers probably weren't that familiar with. Like if I can't get it on Amazon and I can't get it at my local box store, then it probably doesn't exist, right? Like, and so I think that today, one, the consumer space is far more educated than they've ever been. But they're also bombarded with so many more options that aren't
Yeah.
necessarily any better than they were 10 years ago. So, to your point about hardening, I think it's the conversation that says, hey, whatever it is that we have purchased to put in your environment, there are no warm fuzzies or baselines that have been put in place for this machine. We just have to accept that as a reality. And that's where I would start with the education component is it doesn't come ready to go, right?
Yep.
Like that's why you called me in the first place, right? You're not asking me to, hey, I can't get on the internet. Yeah, no kidding. It's not patched or it doesn't have this or like, right? Like, remember when we used to have to go download drivers onto flash drives, then plug them into the computer so we could get them on the internet?
No, I
Thankfully,
think
those
you
days are gone.
I actually really like the way you put that story, because a lot of the time I hear MSPs trying to educate on the importance of hardening and the security function of hardening itself, or wanting to talk about direct settings.
You
But yeah, exactly. But what you just said is almost taking a step back and saying, hey, when you buy this off the shelf, it doesn't have any of those extra warm and fuzzies. It's not going to operate perfectly out of the box. So it's almost selling them to say, hey, let me set this up properly for you and then let you run with it. And you never even have to use the word hardening.
Right.
Is that
We
is
don't
that
buy
a good
cars that
approach?
way. Think about buying a car. If you went and bought a brand new car today, what else are they going to sell you before you leave that place? We're going to put a ceramic coating on it. We're going to put the like, and how much extra did I spend? Oh, that was an extra $2,500. But today and only today, we took half of that
Price
off,
goes
right?
up on Monday. We've all heard
Right.
that line.
Right. It's the same thing though, right? And no consumer of a car is questioning the integrity or the value of the vehicle that they're purchasing because they just added 5 other things I can put on it
Mm-hmm. No, I think
for
that's great.
hardening.
Yep. So you said one other thing. Solutions maybe haven't changed that much in the last 10 years. Some of them, right? Obviously, we have new technology and whatnot. But a big topic that I've talked to Matt Lee about, I've talked to you about, is how vendors are needing to mature and potentially start to integrate the CIS controls, or mapping to or not regulated, but mapping to a framework to help MSPs and help business owners understand where that security solution fits.
Sure.
Do you want to talk towards this? Is this something you believe vendors should be doing?
Absolutely. So, without giving away too much, I can tell you that over the past 6 months, I'd say, Matt Lee does these workshops everywhere. I've been privileged enough to do some of the workshops with him. And basically what we do is we go in and sit with solution providers and talk through, what is this safeguard asking of me, right? Like, what's the intentionality behind the safeguard, and what would evidence look like if I was successful in satisfying the safeguard? And one of the things that happened at one of the workshops that we were doing, I think this was actually at PAX 8 Momentum here just a few weeks back.
I heard
And
that went really great.
it was
So,
awesome.
yep.
It was very cool. And I was privileged to be a part of that conversation. It was interesting because someone asked this question after Matt and I had kind of emphasized, like, hey, this is not the tools, right? Like, we're talking about the how and the what here. And someone piped up with, but can I use tools to help me get to
Sure.
the evidence? And I said, wow, I've never had anybody phrase it that way, but 100% absolutely. In some cases, there's no way to get to the evidence or the proof
Yes.
or outcome without using tools to get you there. And I think that's one of the biggest differences we have today versus 10 plus years ago, where the sophistication of tools that we have in any number of categories that MSPs use to reduce overhead, to reduce the noise, those kind of things that exist. So I think that's a big change. But I think to your point about where vendors need help with these tools is marketing departments want to sell on the all the above, right? Like, my product helps solve for these many things. And to what you said before about hardening, I think there's two sides to this coin. One is a vendor being able to show solution providers how they've hardened internally their own environment. We don't want to talk about the shoe cobbler children's shoes, right? Like, that's not like, why are his kids barefoot? Everybody else has shoes, right? Like, that's not what we want with our vendors. But then the second part of that is to articulate where their product either helps solve for a safeguard, and
Yep.
to avoid saying we 100% solve this safeguard. I don't necessarily care if it does. I'm not looking for you to, like, I think at the end of the day, solution providers don't need a vendor to say we solve 100% X. Whether it does or not, I don't know that I'd ever want to say that, marketing or otherwise, but like, show me how the proper implementation of your product or service helps me solve that problem.
I like that a lot. And we have a comment, if we can highlight that on the screen here. Felicia popped in, and I think she very much agrees with you, right? It's a lot of these vendor marketing teams, they want to be this end all solution, right? But the marketing people don't really have a say, right? They can't claim to map to this safeguard without some type of attestation process. Is this something you've considered, or what advice would you give vendors who want to do the right thing and say, yes, we do assist with this control? It's not 100%. I agree with you 100% there, but how can they, what first steps could they take maybe?
So just getting into the specifics of how does my product help satisfy a safeguard, I think would be to look at, like, some of them we see all the time, like, if your RMM tool collects asset information, right? We know that that is a tool that can help um, provide information around asset inventory. I don't think an RMM tool is the inventory destination itself. So if I was thinking about one that comes to mind that's open source is, I think it's called Snipe IT. If you remember, like, sending your friends out to go hunt for snipes, like, it's a great, I love the naming convention because, it's like this imaginary thing, and we're calling it where we store our inventory. But that product, for what it is as a destination to store inventory, if I was the vendor selling that product, I could arguably say this meets the requirement for storing your asset inventory.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does that meet the entire control? No. Does it meet all of the safeguards in that control? No. But if I were to say we meet control 1 of CIS, use our product, I've misled the solution provider. I've confused,
Yeah.
at the very least, I've confused the solution provider. So I think it's showing not just like, hey, we map to these safeguards, but how does a solution provider leverage that product or service in meeting the safeguard? Not, well, if you configured it correctly, well, what's correct?
Yep. Absolutely. I think Felicia definitely agrees with the sentiment you shared there. You're right. There needs to be some type of process in place, especially with the topic we were talking about before here with SolarWinds and FTC coming up. CISOs are taking a lot of this weight of responsibility when they attest to these certain things. So if let's say they too take a vendor at their word, hey, vendor X, I mapped to these controls. This is how we do it. The CISO says, yeah, that's correct, signs off on it. Now they're liable for taking that vendor's word. I mean, can have you been following this SolarWinds and new FTC?
Yeah,
Anything
the
in that?
whole thanks CISO,
Yeah.
and you're now being charged with committing fraud and for misleading on your security posture. So I think there's two things there that are not the product, right? So one is what are the internal security best practices as a company? Because I think at the end of the day, no matter how good a product is, no matter it, let's just say hypothetically someone does release the perfect product. It's perfectly secure, it perfectly does the things we want it to, it completely satisfies the control. Well, who's putting that product in? Are they perfect too? And I think we're always going to have that problem, is even if the product was created in a vacuum and it's perfect, it's going to leave the vacuum in order to be implemented, and then now all of those that are involved with implementing we know are already flawed. So something is very likely to not be done correctly. So I think it's the precursor to that is, yeah, that's the perfect question, to not take the vendors at their word. They need to start showing third party validation that they have been checked by somebody or an organization that is recognized as knowing what to look for and to ensure that it's properly being vetted.
So I don't want to overstep or ask anything I shouldn't, but we have
Yes.
CIS, we have CompTIA, and I think there's some rumors of stuff Matt's doing with PAX 8. I mean, is there ever going to be a place where vendors could, apply for attestation and there's a body that to approve or agree? Is that possible, or is
I
that just
think
impossible?
I don't think that's impossible. I think that's a very realistic hypothetical at this point. I think that there are those out there that are recognizing that vendors want to prove where they help meet safeguards. I mean, if you think about it, the CIS framework, if I can call it that, and the safeguards therein, if you're a vendor today deciding what product to create next, and you could pick a safeguard on there that would be extremely valuable in security and hardening, like I don't know, like maybe a Senteon, like not to paint the elephant in the room here, but like that's huge, right? Because now a solution provider that's aligning with a security set of safeguards can go through and say, wait, there's a vendor that can help me meet that safeguard, help their product helps me solve for. And oh, by the way, this has been looked at by a third party to say, yeah, originally they had said we meet completely this safeguard, but after going through the third party review, it partially meets, and here's what else needs to be included in order for this safeguard to be fully satisfied.
Yeah. I think the coolest thing, and I can talk about the vendor point of view, and I agree with you, as an early stage vendor, it was no longer, hey, Senteon says we need to set these settings to this state. It was Senteon is telling you that CIS, we did the hard work of reading and documenting, is telling you to do this, not
Right.
us. So
Right.
having that, but expanding this as a future feature request, which would be really cool, is as a vendor to go there, not only a test to, hey, I want to submit for these safeguards or submit for these, having someone on the other end say, hey, you're actually kind of close to helping out with this safeguard.
Yeah.
This is how you could build out your solution to meet more. Almost having like a consultant with your roadmap to align to CIS or another framework.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So, cart before the horse. The SaaS Advisory Council for CompTIA at ChannelCon in August, they released their factors to consider when selecting a SaaS vendor, and it's got I forget 20 or 25 questions, and they're not questions around what safeguards do you help us solve for, right? Because I mean, good grief, there are vendors out there that don't necessarily focus on the cybersecurity space, right? But it was questions that, for the trust mark that we have out today for solution providers, when they get into the CIS for third-party service provider management, like, what's the questions that I should ask? And if I had 1,000 trust mark holders all satisfying that question, all asking Senteon, please answer the following 25 questions. At some point, you're like, dude, I've already answered these questions and I'm not going to keep answering them anymore. So
Yep.
where can a solution provider go to see that? So I think that to your statement about in the future,
Hmm.
going broader than that is an absolute must. And I think it's, and quite honestly, any vendor out there listening, I hope you're selfish enough to recognize that this is in your best interest to have that, so that we stop bombarding you with the same questions over and over again.
I think we need to elaborate on that one here in a second. But first, I want to highlight this comment from Felicia. She was the guest last week, incredible guest, big champion of the importance of security configuration management. She goes here to say it is the key between success and failure of any technology. Do you agree with that? Like how detrimental can it be from a security point of view for a end client to be using just a default out of the box Windows machine? Like, is that actually a risk we should take seriously, or
It's not just a computer or a desktop firewall. I mean, this is what has plagued our industry for decades, and I didn't know I needed that until I saw it at the show. I bought it on the show special. I installed it. My client is mad at me because we didn't install it correctly and it's not working. And now I'm on the Reddit boards bashing on this vendor who may or may not ever come back from this, because it was more important to get it sold and out there than it was to make sure the people that were going to implement it knew what they were doing.
I can't echo that statement enough. Especially with more premium solutions. Like, for example, in our case, we're doing 900 of these CIS recommendations. It's a beast, right? If you don't have the right person managing our tool, it could break something. It could cause that disruption. And going to those Reddit boards, if you just have that one angry person who bought the
Right?
shiny new widget and set it up without reading the documentation, without taking their time, it can leave a bad taste to that now promising company's trajectory, right? That's a very real scenario.
Well, one could argue today, in today's world, one does not have to be very technical to be a successful MSP. Like, you don't necessarily have to have technical staff, strong technical, to be successful, because so many of these things, like for example, to what Senteon does. If previously I did all of my Windows OS hardening by hand,
Mm-hmm.
and now I'm competing with the MSP who has incorporated Senteon into their environment, and they're not hiring, good 10 years experience engineer that's been working with GPOs and
They have a help desk guy
right,
who can do
right.
Senteon.
Yeah. So I think that's extremely valid today, is that there's a lot of illusional, maybe delusional is the right word, of believing that you can do the level of depth from a security standpoint, or even just general technology infrastructure, because the tools have become so sophisticated that you can make even the worst tech look like a rock star
I
as long as
love
the
that.
tool's configured correctly.
I love that statement, and I think ease of use is critical for the vendors as well. We
Agreed.
talked about the vendor point of view of needing to align to CIS. Let's kind of switch the tables a little bit. I think this is almost a topic that's almost growing too popular to talk about. But why should MSPs choose a framework to follow? Obviously, we just talked about the vendor side, but what benefit does the MSP have to following CIS or another framework?
Well, I think it's kind of, I don't even want to use the words that are coming to my brain right now. I would say the number one reason is because if you have a set of standards, safeguards that have been defined by an industry or an independent group, in order to, to establish one end goal, which is to protect the data. And I think CIS is a great example of all data has unique and potentially differing degrees of necessity depending on the lens that you're looking at it through, right? What's important to you might not be important to me. versus the other frameworks that are out there that are very focused on, like, obviously PCI, DSS,
Yep.
that's very much credit card,
Yep.
HIPAA, obviously EPHI records, and so on and so forth, right? Like, they have targeted a very specific data type where CIS is saying, we're not going to decide what is or isn't important. Obviously, that's why they map so well to so many of the other frameworks with their approach. And I
Yep.
think it's interesting because if you have a conversation with any solution provider that suddenly says, oh no, we're going to do CMMC or 800-171 or fill in the blank, not CIS. I'm not going to discourage that. But at the end of the day, one of the things I find interesting is in many cases, they are picking a heavier lift to satisfy when they haven't really started on any program yet. And if they're to look more closely at CIS and the way it provides some prescription and direction to getting these safeguards satisfied, that they would be actually setting themselves up for success with those other frameworks, so that they're not trying to, climb a mountain and they haven't, gotten their, legs underneath them yet, now that they're 15,000 feet above sea level.
So it sounds like the way you view CIS is as a strong foundation to make the more arbitrary requirements
Yeah,
of HIPAA and PCI easier
absolutely.
to meet. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things where fill in the blank framework that provides linear and logical direction in the approach to getting that accomplished. And so, I mean, I'll tell you, that's why CompTIA, when we built the cybersecurity trust mark for MSPs, for solution providers, CIS was the foundation. I mean, I think everybody that was in that working group was like, this is the best case scenario, because while it says for everyone, let's be honest, it looks like it was written to solution providers.
I like that a lot. And can you introduce that a little bit more? Again, this is high level. A lot of our audience may be first hearing about CIS for the first time, but CompTIA, CIS, competitors, friends, who's CompTIA to CIS?
I would like to think that we're kind of a pretty big champion. So for CIS, so we have an agreement with CIS to leverage CIS safeguards inside the trust mark. So almost 2/3 of the trust mark is built around CIS. We don't quite use all 153 safeguards, but it is upwards of more than 2/3. So I can definitively say I think it's around 133 safeguards. So
well over 2/3.
Yeah, and so I'll just give you a couple examples of a safe, like one of the safeguards we took out. 1.5, safe passive scanning. I don't want a solution provider to go out and spend somewhere between 10 and 30 grand on a solid passive scanning tool. I'm not saying that passive scanning is not important. I'm not saying any of those things, but I'm saying, like, for the trust mark, we wanted the barrier of entry to be as low as possible.
Okay. I like that a lot. That sounds really cool. And yeah, that was really the good stuff. Anything else you want to add before we start going into today's configuration topics?
Man, I just want everybody to know that I'm soft and squishy. So if you have barbs to throw because my technical prowess isn't up to the level that Zach thinks it should be, just know that I can talk about these things at a high level.
Your hands on keyboard. It's been a few years.
That's right.
All right, let's hop into some of these slides. So today's topic is actually one of the more advanced ones. Chris thought he would challenge himself at the time of me asking him. So we do have a variety of topics in the configure in the network section of CIS. So we'll be doing network connection settings, TCP/IP settings, Windows Connect Now. So we have quite the array. But what we're looking at here is we did list out about 6 MITRE attack techniques that can be better mitigated by hardening the settings we're talking about today. So Chris, do you mind just kind of calling out a few of these and just introducing to the audience what these are and why they're bad, I guess?
Well, I mean, I got this one hands down. Unauthorized or risky network connections. I know that one definitively is just, you should not do that. But man in the middle attacks, that's a big one. And I think unauthorized network sharing and configuration. I mean, really, these all kind of, you need all 6 of them, right? Like if I take them any one by itself, it becomes less and less relevant or in the understanding of what our goal is, if I start taking these away, it becomes a little bit less, well, why would I do that? But then you put these all together on the slide like you did, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's, I should definitely, harden these things. And
Yep.
I think if I were just thinking about this completely non-technical for a second, we were talking about this at the beginning. If I'm talking to the end user about hardening, oh my word, like, yeah, the eyes might glaze over at some of this, but if you were to explain why it's bad to connect to the wireless connect, public
Hmm.
Wi-Fi
Hmm.
at the airport, it's bad. I think it's less bad today than it was years ago. But if I put all 6 of these together in the same presentation to that same end user, now the perspective on why I should consider seriously before I connect what the potential repercussions are changes that hygiene for that user.
I think I could completely revamp the order of my presentation. Just say, take one of these attacks and then list out the configs to talk about when relating to this, right?
Right.
I mean, that's what CIS is ultimately getting to everyone tuning in for the first time, right? These are proactive steps that we can take to mitigate the risk of possible low-hanging attack chains, or attack techniques, which is what we're looking at here. Mhm.
Well, so unauthorized network sharing.
Sure.
So obviously this is something we do all the time with our cell phones as hotspots, right? So uh, do you see this being a significant challenge with end users sharing the Wi-Fi, say, of their laptop?
I've come across it one time where they had a proper use case, built out the exception for the individual machine, and moved on.
But
Hmm.
you don't normally see them doing
Not
this
normally.
out of intent, right? Like,
Mm-mm.
it's the fact that it's there and it could be exploited because it hasn't been hardened. And I
Yep.
think that's the part that is missing in a lot of the conversations we have with our clients is it's not that it's going to happen with you, like that you are going to go do this because you didn't know anything about it before I started telling you that it was possible, right? Like so it raises the question, like, why do we need to tell them about this versus just harden the machine?
Hmm. I think that's one of the challenge. Because you've put it in great perspective, right? It's not selling hardening directly. It's selling
Mm-mm.
the risk mitigation, the amount of risk that is lessened by doing hardening, right? The output of hardening. A lot of my conversations is wanting to sell the technical aspect. And Felicia talked about this last week, the technical control aspect of hardening, because we in the IT space, we find it interesting. We want to learn about it, but our end
Sure.
clients don't care.
No,
Um,
I'd be
it,
worried if they did.
yeah, they probably wouldn't need an
Why? Yeah, I was
MSP.
gonna say, why did they hire us again?
So that's really cool. And I guess when you're talking about hardening to your end clients, who do you think would listen? Are these like an executive conversation? Is this a conversation with a specific department or person? Who do you need to talk to as an MSP?
Well, so I'm not an MSP anymore. So at CompTIA, this is not part of my daily vocabulary. But when I was an MSP, I think this is an interesting area. So MSPs largely serve the SMB space, right? Like the larger the company that's being served, the higher the probability that they have resources internally to solve for, if not all things that are, say, in this 6, but some of them, right? So I think that if I'm talking about this with SMB level, it's just the decision maker to say that these are things that need to happen within your organization to mitigate, to your point, reduce the risk, reduce the probability of things being exploited that actually at the end of the day bear little to no impact on their day to day, right? Like if you remove the ability for me to do network sharing from my laptop, I would
Mm-hmm.
have no idea that you did that. I mean, if I went and looked, I might, and if I knew where,
Sure.
assume I know where to look. Why would I go look, right? But if you're getting into the bigger clients, which I know MSPs out there that have them, it really requires a buy-in from the internal IT department. If you don't have buy-in with them, I don't care what you get from the leadership team, you still have to get the implementation to happen, and that's going to be that IT department. And if they don't agree with you or they don't want to do it, they'll make it pretty stinking difficult for that to happen.
Yep. Oh, spot on. I like that. So Let's with that, let's go into some of these CIS recommendations. So as we talked about, these are all preventative, proactive things. They may not apply to everyone, but this first setting here, prohibit installation and configuration of network bridge on your DNS domain network. So, I imagine these bridges could be used by attackers to move traffic or do whatever they need to. Could you talk a little bit more about this at a high level?
Yeah, a little bit at a high level. So
Mm-hmm.
this made me think about things like when you might run a virtual machine on your laptop.
Mm-hmm.
How is it getting to the internet? So I think what's interesting about this is you're often allowing for a device, if this type of sharing is happening, is that they don't have the security protocols installed on them. So now you're introducing all of it's like a raw connection to the internet because
Yep.
it's not being seen by the infrastructure that you put in place to protect it.
Yep.
Is that
Like
pretty close?
I think that's a good explanation. And it's just always important to note that this stuff is not enabled by default, right? This is something that needs to be explicitly set so that the attackers can't change it. Felicia mentioned this in the comments. You need to make sure these are monitored, reviewed,
Right.
staying hardened after it, because you go do a PowerShell script. I mean,
Yeah.
Chris, you were an MSP at one point. I mean, before technology caught up like Senteon and the other providers in
Sure.
this space, how did you harden these settings? Was it just a script, a little bit of Intune? Can you elaborate at
I
all
mean,
on
I'll be
that?
honest. I think at the endpoint level, we focused heavily on is the Windows machine, current on patches and application
That was
patching, that
that
kind of
was
thing.
what you needed to get done,
That was
right?
pretty much the main thing. And then, I mean, we've talked about this before. I don't care who you are, and listening to this right now, how many did a good job of managing, securing, and protecting on the browser side? Like, no, you can't install that extension. That's a proxy. Like, it's doing exactly what you're talking about right here. Um, the other one that comes to mind too, that you said going back in time. Well, how about today when I can choose the flavor of Linux that I have running as my subsystem in Windows
Yep.
11 or Windows 10 even? Right.
Yep.
Like, whoops.
I think that's one of the interesting things, because when you do get into it, if you do have a Linux subsystem installed, or IIS or FTP, whatever that
Right.
is,
I
some
loaded
of
Kali Linux, by the way, on my subsystem.
so depending what is on that workstation, right? By default, none of it is. But if it is
Right.
there, it's not inherently bad, but it should be documented. And if it is there without approval, there's a different CIS recommendation on how to harden it if it is already present versus absent.
Well, that also goes to it's not inherently good either. So
Sure. Yep.
if it's left to its own devices, it will likely become bad, and you would never know that it was bad.
I like that. Have to cut that one out for the commercials.
Right. Right.
All right, let's get to this next setting. So prohibit the use of network connection sharing on your DNS domain network. So you talked about this a little bit with connection sharing. I mean,
Right.
sharing anything always gives me a little chills. Can't imagine it's typically a good thing. But can you talk a little bit why this is explicitly called out?
Well, you mean specifically internet sharing?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Well, so I think one example, and I think I said this earlier.
mm-hmm,
This is the example of hotspotting with my cell phone, right?
mm-hmm.
But I've suddenly changed all of the potential protections because now I'm going through what is likely an added security layer that's not security for me and my company, but more of the traffic has just become encrypted. So being able to manage, monitor, and maintain where I'm going has been lost as it's gone through
Yep.
that second layer of encryption.
So if you are doing this and the attacker does get a foothold, right, they can use this to then get into that domain level and
Mm-hmm.
cause even more damage. Another favorite terminology I like to mention on this as much as possible is that blast radius, right?
Right.
One compromised machine is bad,
Right.
but 100 machines, 1,000 machines, right? It's about eliminating that initial foothold, and if they grasp it, mitigating the damage, keeping them there.
Well, and you see this with insurance, Zach, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, they now actually ask questions around VPN, and the question may say
Oh,
something to the effect of, "Do you allow split tunneling? So one path to the
insurance
internet and
does?
one." This came up on an insurance questionnaire. Like, whoa, who wrote this questionnaire? They must have been on this show at some point in time. We
think
know what they're talking about.
I'll have to plug a webinar coming up in December. I will be talking with Will from Fifth Wall about cyber insurance and OS configs. So stay
Nice.
tuned for that. Have to bring up that form probably. So interesting.
CIS talks about it.
Are you seeing anything else on cyber insurance forms? I know personally I've seen, do you have a hardened baseline? Yes or no, but it doesn't ask for the extent of, right? Because a hardened baseline could be 20 settings while Senteon's offering 500.
I don't think they have enough actuary data yet in the insurance space to really ask those questions at a more granular level. I think one example of where we're going to start seeing better questions was the traveler's insurance, where they didn't pay out because the MFA was not on all systems, and the question was written in such a way that answering yes was implying that it was on all systems, even though the question didn't say, is it on all systems? So I think that's and I don't know that that's necessarily a good question in the first place, because if the data that is to be protected is not valued, do I really need to have MFA in place in getting to that destination? So I think we're going to see more questions that are more accurate in the ask that don't necessarily group answer safeguards and say CIS.
That'll be fun to see how this all plays out, man. MSPs are in for it. You're at the forefront.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's hop into this next one. So, require domain users to elevate when setting a network's location. So, this makes sense intuitively to me, right? If you're sharing a network's location, you're going to want to make sure you're an admin, you have the proper authority to do this. But talk to us a little bit about this setting.
Well, I can talk about what I think is problematic with this is the flip side, which is removing networks afterwards. So you see a lot of, yes, they should require elevation to connect, but what I see a lot of is they don't require that. But in order to remove a network that you've connected to, I have to have elevated privileges. So to this one, this kind of goes hand in hand with allowing me to connect to, say, public Wi-Fi. If it requires authentication, obviously that creates a pause. Even if I have the credentials to do it, right? It's an added step of, is this the right network that I should be connecting to? What potential harm? I mean, we've already talked about it all the way up to this point, basically solving for the same thing. Network's location is a big deal too, right? So if I'm remote connecting into the office and my location is now, say, questionable, or the timetable since the last time I connected to now there's no humanly possible way I could have, light speeded to that part of the world. California to New York in 20 seconds, right?
Things will get really complicated once that type of travel is feasible.
Then we would suddenly say that the technology that we use today is way behind what it needs to be.
Yep. I think that's a good explanation on that one. Anything else to add, or should we hop over to the next setting?
I would just say to this one, I think this is really interesting when we look at SaaS applications, when we're connecting, when we're being very careful of what applications, we hear this all the time. So like if you're in the hotel, don't decide to do banking and reconcile your books while you're there, right? Like, be smart about those things. And I think this is an area where it's really hard. We talked about hardening of the system. This is a good example of having conversations with the client around, what do you allow the device to be used for and where, based on sensitive information? And I would say most probably have no idea and don't discourage any of it.
And I think that's a good conversation just to approach the topic of hardening even, right? Just bringing up, hey, what is this used for? Okay, if I can make this more secure while allowing that function, would you be interested in that? I mean, who would say no in that situation?
Like, I want phishing simulation and actual bad mail to show up in my inbox and have it be like, I know that's bad because these environmental variables have been violated, not because the email itself is or isn't bad.
I like that. It's awesome. All right, let's go to this next setting, and it literally has hardened in the name. So hardened UNC path. So know a little bit about this setting, but this has to do with the network paths and making sure you protect the net logon and sysvol shares. Kind of prevents that man in the middle type of attack. Anything additional to add on this?
So I'm terrible with this one. In fact, if my my former senior engineer was on here, he'd be like, Chris says stuff and he obviously understands what he's talking about, but the person he's talking to may have no idea what he's trying to articulate because he's used words that are definitely not meant for this space. The thing that I would say that comes to mind for this one, though, is, and it was available in Windows 10, and I think it started, I don't remember what server edition it started with, where it was natively off, but the SMB path being just available, so you could just start typing and all of a sudden it's like autocomplete showing you whatever is available across the network. I think this is a good example of that and why UNC paths are so important.
That's a great example. Good cross reference there. So makes sense. Definitely want to mitigate that. And we have about four or five more settings here. So we're making pretty good time. We'll go a little bit faster through these, but let's look at the next one. Talking about IPv6. This is something I hear about all the time. Could you kind of just tell us at a high level, IPv6 and why we'd want to make sure this is followed?
Well, I mean, to reduce complexity for one, I mean, that would be where I would start.
Yep.
I think this is it's funny. It's 2023. And I would argue that there's not very many organizations actually taking advantage of IPv6. So disabling IPv6 is interesting because it feels like we're going in the opposite direction. Like, I don't know. This is one that I'm not
more technical to it. Possibly one of the L2 configurations here.
Sure.
But yeah, there's definitely some complexity here. If you don't use it, I believe there's, just it's more refined. There's less.
To add clarity, and I think this is where I might show that I might know a little bit, is that don't enable protocols that you're not using. I mean, let's just make it that would be to sum up this whole conversation is if it's not being used, why is it on?
I think
we might want to do FTP. We might want to have our own mail relay on our host server. So let's go ahead and leave that open.
I think we had a guest a few weeks ago, Marty, who said he really likes Linux because they come locked down and you have to proactively enable things as you can't do them. That would be a different mentality for Microsoft to ever implement that, and it would eliminate businesses in my space, but it would probably get a lot more hardened machines.
And someone just posted there's no use case for IPv6 in private networks for the vast majority of organizations. I couldn't agree with you more because for the number of networks I've configured over the years, still to this day, it's just not being used.
Nice. Oh, you can highlight that. It's all good. All right, let's hop over to this next setting. Appreciate the comments in today. This is awesome. So looking at this next one here, configuration of wireless settings using Windows Connect Now. Windows Connect Now, isn't this, it's one of the innate settings so Microsoft can remote in? Is that right?
That was my understanding, but I have not ever found a good reason to have this enabled. So
I think that's fair. Disabled by default. There's no reason to give Microsoft more access than they need.
And to take this one a little bit further, and it's not just Windows and maybe not so much in the configs, but turn off on your phone auto join networks when if it's an open network, don't auto join that network. Turn that stuff off.
I like it. All right, we got another Windows Connect Now setting. So again, it's just prohibit access of the Windows Connect Now wizard. So same type of mentality. Anything else you want to add on this?
No, and I think this is kind of par for the course. We saw this back in the day in the consumer world where, you have the WCS, you get the modem and it's got the little button on the front. To make it easy to connect, just push the button and magic.
I think the icon on this slide does well.
Yes, absolutely. The wizardry.
I think that's perfect. All right, this next setting here is one of the fan favorites whenever we do onboard. Minimize the number of simultaneous connections. So what this is saying here, making sure you can't use Wi-Fi while you're already plugged into Ethernet. Is there ever a use case where you would need both, or is that just a risk not needing to approach?
So I'm not going to say that there's not a scenario where
Sure.
that would make sense.
Security space, man. Everything depends.
Right. And well, so I would say this, like if you're doing network management type stuff and your wireless connection is on one VLAN to get out to the internet, like whether you're downloading firmware, that kind of thing, and then the other one is you plugged in so that you could update configs on switches, those kind of things. I could see that, but we're talking about a very unique, specific use case, not the general like. And I think it's the person doing that would be very intentional. I think this goes hand in hand with the say VPNing. Like, why would you want to split tunnel? I don't get the protections that I get when I go through that VPN, nor do I get the logging or the ability to do any sort of log correlation. So yeah, this goes hand in hand with that. You don't get this. I mean, how much log correlation do you want to do with traffic? If I'm split tunneling, you've just made the person who's got to solve the problem that much more difficult.
Yep, absolutely. And that's one thing I also want to highlight here with CIS, right? By hardening these settings, you're reducing the amount of noise. You're making those logs or post-breach mortems easier to sift through, easier to find that breach source or however you want.
It's like you said, it's not just the right of boom. This is about reducing the blast radius.
Yep. Oops, sorry. Cool. So let's see what this next setting. Oh, we got a comment. Yep. Not for end users. I think that's spot on, right?
Yes.
Love that.
And that's the conversation we should be having with clients. I mean, obviously, don't tell them stuff that they really don't need to know, which was kind of yeah. Like if they wouldn't know that they were split tunneling, why does it matter, right?
Yep. And I'm curious, and maybe Felicia has a comment on this one too, but Chris, one of the coolest things I've noticed since onboarding Senteon is, we're doing 500 configuration changes. It's no small feat, right? It's quite a bit. But what I'm noticing is the majority of MSPs who are using Senteon out there in their fleet is they don't have that many exceptions. And from what I've understood, they don't even tell the end client it's going on because there's such limited noise. And I know, so we do log on warning text, make sure they have to type in the username, maybe control delete. So they let them know of the few things, like 5 different things, but then the other 450, they don't know, they don't need to know, right? Why educate to that extent? Is it worth the MSP's time to go that in depth?
I mean, I quite honestly would argue that most MSPs leveraging Senteon aren't necessarily educating their own staff on all 455 plus scenarios.
Yep. I love that. All right, let's get into the next couple settings here. 2 more. So prohibit connection to non-domain networks when connected to domain authenticated network. That one makes sense as I'm reading it, but anything else you want to add to it?
No. I mean,
do it. Have this enabled.
So one that comes to mind, and you see this a lot. You see this a lot in environments where they're trying to save money. Remember Log4j?
Oh,
so we all do, right? Like, so I remember thinking like Synology, QNAP, the different ways in which we'd create non-domain joined storage. This would be a perfect example of what we see in environments where allowing my device to connect to that, which now is connecting to something that I pretty confident is not being managed, right? Because it's not on the domain. It's not even likely visible with my RMM tools. So identifying, vulnerability scanning, those kind of things. I mean, hopefully it's on a different VLAN if you do have one, but like, it's probably not even being, in many cases, all of the potential risk is so high when you connect to a non-domain network.
Yeah, I like that. All right, and we got the last setting of the day, and we are making time beautifully. So allow Windows to automatically connect to suggested.
I already did this one.
We've talked about this one a little bit over. As you can tell, these are categorized by CIS for us.
Sure.
But it is worth noting, so many of these coincide, right? There's not just one setting about hotspot. There's 3, there's 4, right? So making sure you go through all of these settings to make sure it's actually disabled, right? You might have 3 of the 4 disabled, but what about that 4th?
Well, so it's interesting that we talk about this again, because one of the things I had said before was like, the privilege network, you got to raise privileges to authenticate to a new wireless network or, whatever network. But What about removing them? So let's use the example here of connecting to an open network. So your Starbucks, your Boingo, your
Yep.
airports, your hotels. So if I've ever stayed at a Marriott, let's just say I've stayed at it 10 times or 2 times, right? Like I'm going to go back to a Marriott hotel, to potentially a different hotel that has the same SSID, and my computer is already going to have that stored. It is not privileged for me to remove it. And now I'm going and connecting, doing exactly what this says. But because it's already been authenticated, it's allowing me in.
Yep. Don't need that. You
No,
can type in the credentials the next time you're
that's
there.
right.
Now, that's perfect. And I'm looking at my interactive Q&A questions that I had preempt. You actually answered a lot of them throughout. So if there are any questions from the audience, please drop them into the comments. Otherwise, Chris, I'm going to let you just kind of talk towards a little bit more. Feel free to talk more about the topic, but also if you're noticing any trends just with configuration management or MSPs you want to highlight while we have the time.
I think that one of the biggest things, whether it's, Senteon or other products that help you reduce the amount of FTE to solve some of this. I mean, you and I talked about this before. There's examples out there trying to meet the CIS security baselines, and I remember, I think I shared with you one project where I think it was tied to an Exchange server. It took them 11 months to get it completely to meet that criteria, and it's like
That was
MSPs
one
have
time. That
one
was
time.
one server. That's not a whole fleet.
Yeah. And can you imagine all the other things that we should be focused on? Like, I really think we're at a place in the threat landscape where it's unfortunate the amount of energy that MSPs spend at the actual device level when there are so many tools and resources out there to help you automate that so you can focus on really what is out there trying to attack.
So one thing me and you have talked offline about, but this concept of browsers needing to be hardened, and there's not enough hardening going on today at the browser. It's
Yeah.
becoming the container of all your SaaS apps. Have you noticed any trends on the browser level? And then we'll get to this question here.
Yeah. So I think this is a perfect example of a browser as an application is almost an operating system, right?
I
Everybody
like
knows of
that.
Chrome OS, the Chrome browser
Mhm,
running a
mhm.
Chromebook, right? Like it's basically just a browser, right? Or is it? So I'd say that the biggest challenge we have in the browser space, aside from making sure that it maintains patching and all of that, is ensuring that you're not just having a wide open extensions store. So like, I mean, we even see now that there's extensions, there's widgets, and there's apps that all live inside the browser ecosystem. And I think if you're not managing that, which is way more difficult, I think, than managing the
Absolutely.
operating system.
Absolutely.
Is that's where I think we're going to see the energy focus come. I mean, like I mean, I don't know if we've talked about this, but like for each browser, it ranges between 150 and 200 plus pages. Unfortunately, it's illustrated, or it would be even worse,
Yes.
right? But it's 200 pages to get to a
Yes.
secure baseline configuration for one browser.
Yep. And that's exactly from CIS is what he's referencing. I can drop the download link in the comments, but and that's one of the trends Senteon sees as well, right? That's where we want to build our solution to map to more to CIS, and that is one of the things Senteon will be offering here soon. We actually had a question in the comments I want to highlight for you, Chris.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on this one, or is this beyond your disconnect from technical
A
world?
little yes and no. So I think that non-domain joined is not the same as hybrid AD. So if you're truly running hybrid AD, then the rules apply, right? So if it's functioning properly, hybrid AD for sure would be. In fact, I think it's brilliant when anybody's moved stuff in the cloud but still have on-prem. You should implement hybrid AD because then you benefit from a lot of the security controls that doesn't live locally on a domain controller, but is only available through the Microsoft offerings out there. But it does get then trickled down to on-prem environment. But the AAD, I assume they're talking about Azure AD.
Mhm.
So that would get into a couple things. One, are you using a machine that is not authenticated to that Azure AD environment? Or are we talking about a device just connecting to an Azure server, like a VM that lives inside an Azure AD ecosystem? that's a little bit different because of the way in which you're connecting. So I don't want to get too far down in the weeds on this, but I would argue that we're talking about more what we're referring to more specifically is on your local network with this particular config. We're talking about non-domain devices that are accessible and preventing that from happening.
Like that. And on those Azure boxes or anything, whether it's AD, domain joined, you still need bias, but you should still be hardening those local policies because that's the only way to assure they're actually implemented successfully, didn't drift after you deployed that script, after you deployed that change, making sure it stays in place. The only way to do it is at the local level.
But for clarity, I think that was the control safeguard that we were talking about was tied to local network.
Got it. All right. Awesome. Chris, we're right at the hour. Any other closing remarks? I think you did a really good wrap up there with the last couple minutes.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, very cool, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for the Q&A, since Chris answered all of my preempt questions throughout the webinar. But we are here every single week. We aim for every Wednesday, and you're going to notice a couple TBDs on there. Might have Felicia back to talk about printers next week. But printers is not the hottest topic in the MSP space. No one was jumping at the opportunity. And we do have Roddy coming back on for part 2. He's going to go into some of the next gen configuration recommendations through CIS. Those are super highly impactful, but good for security if you can handle it. I do have the CIS Unlocked benchmark series newsletter. We do dive into these benchmarks every single week in a more documented format. And as always, in this last slide, we do offer Senteon as a free NFR for MSPs. Do a risk assessment, see where you sit with CIS. I'm inclined to think everyone here will likely be at the default state. So it's what we usually see. It's not inherently bad, but get after it. Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for the time. Appreciate you being here, Chris.
Thanks, guys.